Hello everyone to a new video. Today I'm talking about my view on the cognitive functions, how I think they might work. This is an unscripted video, so I usually like to do scripted videos, but when I try to script my theories on cognitive functions, it's usually very hard. So I'd rather just ramble on a bit, think out loud, so to speak. And yeah, generally try to, clear up any misconceptions first before I start getting into it. That my views on cognitive functions are quite similar to Harry's from Cognitive Personality Theory. If you've seen his channel, you know. And I also should point out that I want to talk about cognitive functions in the sense that they are underlying psychological processes and they do not determine your personality. They may have a likelihood for a personality to develop a certain way, but they're never the sole de facto reason for personality. Which means that, stereotypes assigned to a group of functions is really just a probabilistic means to define them, rather than trying to really determine what's going on inside. So to start everything off, I guess I'll start saying something that's really bugging me in my mind, which is, people start talking about cognitive functions, they'll go, well, extroverted intuition is this, introverted sensing is this other thing. So I think when you try to separate something like intuition and sensing, you start getting into problems. I've been trying to make theories for years now, and well, it would do me well to get them out there. I can never truly reach a formula to determine which one is which, a good definition, so to speak. It's because I always reach the conclusion that they are all just two sides of the same coin. And when you say, and when people try to explain them, essentially what they're doing is they're saying they're two different coins, So the best way to actually go about it is to reduce everything to its most basic components, which is to say there aren't four judging functions. There aren't two judging functions either. It's not that there's feeling and thinking, no. There's just the judging function. That's all there is to it. And then there's also the perceiving function. But that's just it. There's two functions. And here the real question is, can perceiving and judging be are they also two sides of the same coin? Because we see that perceiving and judging are working together in pretty much every model. And my question was, how are they working together? Because it may be that they're the same thing, so they're two sides of the same coin, and we're again creating this illusion of separation. Or they're different things. But if they're different things, how are they working together? And I think the best guess we can make here is that they're like two links in a chain, so they are like a Venn diagram. So are they the same thing? The answer is yes and no, because at the center of the Venn diagram they have things that are in common, and then on each side they have things which are different, which means they're still compatible, and that's the way they work together, by having things in common, but they're also different because they have their differences. So in general, we could say that any type, any cognitive type, is just going to be a judging function working together with a perceiving function. And that's all there is to it. There's really nothing more. The first thing that must be analyzed is how one becomes dominant. So why would the judging function become dominant over the perceiving, which would be the auxiliary, or or vice versa, or the other way around. And then we have another big question, which is how does one become introverted or extroverted? How the function becomes introverted or extroverted. And it might be, as Jung put it, I don't treat Carl Jung as the Bible. In fact, my own theories really diverged from Carl Jung's theories for a long time, but as I learn more and more about these things, my theories get closer and closer to what Carl Jung was saying. But anyways, I think, maybe let's formulate this hypothesis that you have a judging function as the dominant and a perceiving as the auxiliary. So whether the person decides to become an extrovert or an introvert is independent from the function. So if the person becomes an extrovert, then the dominant judging function will become an extroverted judging function. And that's because it sort of carries on, so to speak. But the extroversion is a property of the person, not of the function. So that's one theory. I think that's how Carl Jung put it. And I guess first of all, I really do want to tackle the problem of introversion and extroversion. Try to define it as best as possible. So I'll start talking about how we live in a very extroverted world, I think. Let's call extroversion the awake state and introversion the sleeping state. So let's say for example there's a lot of there's many thoughts going in my head, so I'm trying to structure this a bit. When I looked up, I don't know if this is correct, but I looked up if certain insects, if they sleep, or if all living beings sleep, and I got some kind of answer. I don't remember the source, probably some Google search or something. The answer was that, well, some living beings are in this state of half asleep, half awake, so they don't need a sleep period, so to speak. They don't separate it. However, more complex life forms, such as humans or mammals, where, the life forms which separate sleep from awake, they don't totally separate it either. It's mostly separated, but it's not totally separated, in the sense that while we sleep, there's still a part of us that's awake. And while we're awake, there's still a part of us that's asleep. And that's, I think, a very important thing to understand for introversion and extroversion, where extroversion is sort of, we could talk about what Kant called the noumenal world, which is the world of extra perception. So it's outside of perception, and it interacts with the perception of living beings, which means we only have a limited experience of this world, but it doesn't mean we can't deduce things that are going on in it that we don't have experience of. For example, a colorblind person can know about color, so to speak. However, things of this noumenal world have to be deduced, and we just don't know if we've ever discovered everything that is in this world. And it's also limited by our own perceptions in a certain sense. We can't just teleport to France if you're not in France whenever you want. So there's certain bodily limits to this world. And the most important part, I guess, is people think it's a shared world, right? So if I have a candle in a room, I leave the room and someone else goes in that room, they're going to see the same candle I was seeing. So It's sort of an existential question, right? That thing which I stopped thinking about. I stopped thinking about the candle, I stopped interacting with it, but it's still there because it belongs to the noumenal world. So that's sort of like what they call the object. That's like what is all about extroversion. And we'll get into extroversion in a second. Whereas the subject, which is the world of the mind, right? It's consciousness, and I guess it's kind of hard for science to really interact with this world. So we sort of chuck it, we leave it, we say it's a user illusion, right? It's not really there, this world. It's sort of a fake illusion that has emerged from the interaction between very complex parts. If you believe in this world, then you're making a leap of logic, so to speak. Which doesn't mean you can't believe in it. But this world essentially involves your memories, your imagination, your future predictions, which are very important in cognition, right? You're constantly sort of setting expectations and predictions. So this is the subjective world in general. We will just call it the world of dreams, or the side of you that's always asleep or dreaming. And now I'll give another little sort of theory, which says that I think the thing that makes humans different from animals, from other living creatures, is, this is an educated guess, but a guess nonetheless. In cybernetics, they would call it a feedback loop. So what you're doing is you're connecting, I guess it would have to do with a computational device in humans, but I'll get to that in another moment. You would be connecting the output back into the input. So the human is receiving their own output as input. And I'm not saying this isn't enabled for animals. I mean, other living creatures. Since we do have other living creatures which can recognize themselves in the mirror and stuff. But it's probably more like a gradual activation of that component, rather than just we flip a switch from one day to another. And I'm not going to get too much into this, but essentially it just means that there's a sort of self-perception or self-reference that occurs, a metacognition, which human beings are kind of in special possession of, or in very advanced possession of. This self-reference, essentially what happens is that it creates two versions of you. Whereas a living being is really just self-contained in one version of themselves, the version that is observing. Our self is divided into two, which is, there's the me that's observing, and there's the me that's being observed. Therefore, I create two versions of myself. And this is important for introversion and extroversion, because perhaps, for some reason, and this is pretty much the biggest leap of logic, a model, we could say, the version that's being observed either falls into the world of the object, so what we said was the noumenal world, and then we try to reunite with it, by which we feel an attraction towards the objective noumenal world, or that part is perceived to be, or falls into the world of the mind, in which case we feel an attraction to the world of the mind because we're trying to, again, unite with it, and creating introversion. So that's my hypothesis. Very mystical, very esoteric, but that's my best guess for the moment. So in general, we're attributing introversion and extroversion to the person, rather than to the functions, and later the functions inherit the attitude. rather than the other way around, which is how I think most people view the cognitive functions, right? They say if you have extrovert intuition as dominant, then you're an extrovert, because you're inheriting the extroversion from the intuition. But as I put it, and Carl Jung would put it, you're an introvert, so your dominant intuition inherits the introversion of yourself. Now let's talk about the functions themselves. Because as I said, we have a judging function and a perceiving function. That's all there is to it. And if one becomes an introvert, then they both become introverted. And if one becomes an extrovert, then they both become extroverted. So essentially, here we do get... So we start off with two types of people, and I'm not speculating on if this is given by birth, when exactly do these things start developing, because that's just really hard, really hard to determine. I think temperament is already, partly determined by genetics, so some stuff has to come from birth. Maybe, this is just speculation, like, we can create all the models you want, right? You could say the only thing that's determined by birth is that you're a judging dominant, for example, with a perceiving auxiliary, which means there would really be only two types of people, judging dominants or perceiving dominants. Or maybe the introverted or extroverted factor is given by birth, but in any case, once we apply the introversion or extroversion, we do get four types of people, which are, EPs, IJs, EJs, and IPs. So extroverted judging dominance, introverted judging dominance, extroverted perceiving, and introverted perceiving dominance. So in any case, the auxiliary function is always going to present the same disposition as the dominant function, the same direction. So if the dominant is introverted, the auxiliary is introverted. We can see signs of cognitive personality theory here, because what I'm saying is the auxiliary function is really what people talk about as a tertiary in MBTI. For example, an ESTJ, TE dominant, and the NE would be the auxiliary. Just so you get what I'm talking about here. In any case, I don't want to speculate on how exactly thinking and feeling are divided. We've already speculated on how introversion or extroversion get divided. But thinking and feeling or sensing and intuition, that seems a lot more complicated in my opinion. And is a bit sort of like forms an illusion. In any case, I'll just put out my theory about how the classical auxiliary and inferior functions form in MBTI. So what I think is that the dominant is quite a fluid function because it's dominant, which means if you're you're a dominant judging type. If you're extroverted, you're an extroverted judging dominant type, so you're fluid enough to regress into an introverted judging dominant. So you're sort of ambiverted. At rest, you're an extroverted judging dominant, but you feel you're constantly trying to make a connection to your introverted side because it's more like an underlying mystical principle of trying to be imbalanced. So you feel imbalanced because you're constantly in the extroverted state. So you try to balance yourself out by going into introversion. So you're an extroverted judging dominant and you're constantly pulling yourself into introversion. So for example, an ESTJ is constantly using TE, but it's constantly pulling into TI. However, the tertiary, well, what I call the auxiliary, in this case for the ESTJ is NE, is very rigid. And it's rigid because my speculation is that it works as the North Star that people have. I don't know what they call this thing, the compass, well, whatever. They have a name for it. but it's a guide. And when it moves, we get very destabilized, unlike with the dominant function, which is much more fluid. So the tertiary is very rigid because it does not want to introvert, so to speak, at least in an extroverted type. So what happens is the dominant tries to introvert, but the tertiary acts a bit like a guardian, like a, what do you call it, a gatekeeper. So that's what creates the the point of least resistance function, because it's really hard to introvert the tertiary. So or to extrovert it, right? So what happens is when we try to introvert or extrovert our functions, right? When we try to turn them around, we create pseudo functions. So if an ESTJ is trying to introvert into TI, it will create an amalgamation of FE and FI at the same time. But that will probably become the inferior function. I mean, this is really badly explained. There's definitely not a logical consistency here. But I think really the FI of the ESTJ is a failed attempt to go into TI, is all I'm trying to say. Whereas the SI of the ESTJ is a failed attempt of the tertiary going into NI. So the tertiary NE tries to go into NI, fails, and becomes the pseudo SI, which means that the polar function and the auxiliary function are the same thing. Which I could justify a bit, but the video is becoming a bit too long for my taste. So in this sense, this is something I really wanted to point out, and that I'm going to be working with in future videos. So if you didn't reach this part of the video, you might be confused in the future. This is, I think, very important. You see, MBTI and the 4 letters of MBTI have sort of conditioned us to think in terms of letters. And this is kind of fucked, if you ask me. Where people think an INFJ, like, for example, we grab the INFJ, we go, what's the extroverted version of the INFJ? And they will tell you it's the ENFJ, but that's because they're operating on letters. INFJ and ENFJ aren't even the same type, like at the most basic level, because at the most basic level, one's a judging dominant, the other one's a perceiving dominant. So they're worlds apart. They were born totally different, so to speak. So no. In attitude, maybe. A very big maybe. But in cognition, the extroverted version of the INFJ is the ENFP. And I think that's a very important distinction to make, because the NI of the INFJ becomes extroverted into extroverted intuition, and the TI becomes extroverted into extroverted thinking. So the ENFP is the extroverted version of the INFJ, and you can apply this to all types. And there's actually quite... this is a very, very interesting topic to explore. But you also have the opposite of the INFJ, which is the ESTP, with its own introverted version, which is the ISTJ. And these 4 types create a cognitive dynamic. So inside your own cognition, you're fluidly able to change between these types. You're not changing between the types. It means you're not really one of those 4 types. You are some kind of thing that's floating in between all of them. And this is actually what Harry says. Harry from Cognitive Personality Theory. If you go on his website and you study his system a bit, you'll see he reached the same conclusion, which I find very fascinating, and I'll be talking a lot more about it in other videos. But hopefully with this video I've given a bit of a primer on how I right now I view the cognitive functions. I guess every day it'll change a bit, and I'll give new insights in the form of new videos. So yeah, I hope you like this one. If you have any questions, comments, if you wanna, yeah, if you wanna ask anything, just put in the comments. I'll try my best to answer.